Hello, I'm Jean-Paul, the coordinator of the Maltese NGO Inizjamed, the organisers of the Malta Mediterranean Literature Festival in Valletta, Malta. First of all, I would like to thank Versopolis for organising this festival at such a difficult time. We can do with some hope, and we are very excited to contribute to such an initiative. At Inizjamed, we believe in collaboration rather than competition. In fact, a main characteristic of our week-long festival is a translation workshop, in which our invited authors translate each other. It is a great way to mix our ideas, learn from each other, and then equally understand each other. If we beat the odds and we manage to organize this year's edition at the last week of August, we will be celebrating our 15th edition. For us, the Mediterranean is the space that brings people together. And so we also seek writers from both around us and from well beyond our shores. Among them, we have hosted Tamim Barghouti, Hisham Matar, Sion, Marina Warner, and Tasli Erdogan, and we hope to keep on doing so in the years ahead. Antoine Cassar is a Maltese poet and translator. New 40 Days, a book-length poem about childhood trauma, depression and working as self-therapy, was awarded the Malta National Book Prize and has been shortlisted for the 2020 Gdansk European Poet of Freedom Award. Passport, published in 2009, is a long poem printed in the form of an anti-passport for all peoples and all landscapes. Has been published in 11 languages and adapted for the theatre in Malta, France and Belgium. Cassar's multilingual composition, Merhaba, is a poem of hospitality and was also awarded the United Planet Writing Prize in 2009. As a translator, Cassar has rendered the work of fellow Maltese authors into English, notably the short stories of Pierre J. Mailak. The winner of the 2014 European Union Prize for Literature, and Spanish, Alex Vallageras Troiano, was published in May 2019 by Libros de Mentira, Chile. This interview was recorded at last year's edition of our Malta Mediterranean Literature Festival. The interviewee is Simona Cassano.
So that, like in the 9-dot puzzle, I have chosen 9 objects for you. And you have to choose from them randomly. Now I have to tell you that Antoine has not seen any of them. Each object is attached to a question that I have thought of, and each question has inspired me to pick an object. But obviously, that could lead you to something else. And then I will ask you my question. The aim is to get to know you better as a man and as a poet, as a writer. So you can start.
Let me have a look. So, what's this? Do I have to open it and find out?
I think you got the easy one.
It's a journal, right?
Yeah.
It's are these your poems? Are these yours? Huh?
My writing, something I found in the house. My
We'll
question
talk about
is.
them another time. All right. Yeah.
My question is an easy one. This one is an easy one. How do you write? As a translator, you have rendered work of fellow writers. Obviously, these questions are supposed to have no order. Yeah. So obviously, that depends on what you chose. So I've rendered the work of fellow Maltese authors, of foreign authors, and you're a writer yourself. My question the main question is how do you write, but also how translating has changed your way of writing.
And how translation influences the writing process, no?
Exactly.
Okay, so, I mean, I write in a lot of ways, and in the sense that it depends a lot on what I'm writing. I mean, I always have a notebook to take notes wherever I go. But depending on the nature of the book or collection or poem I'm working on, my approach could be different. right? So when I wrote The Passport, I did a lot of research, first of all, because it's a poem about borders and what borders do to people, and I needed information, right? And then, but to focus on the 40 days, I wrote it through walking. So, for many years, I thought that writing about family taboo or family trouble and about depression would be banal. But of course, that was my fear. I postponed it for a long time. Until one day, well, one night actually, I woke up from a nightmare and squiggled down what then became Layl Zero, night zero, the fall. A bit like it's a kind of Dantesque beginning. And the following day, I began to walk 1 or 2 hours every day, because I knew that by walking I would gather the courage to think more boldly and to walk into myself. So Rousseau, who was from the Jura region, he wrote a lot about this, about walking as a means of gaining courage to express yourself. Walking also, it opens neural pathways, you know, and the more kilometers you cover, the more mental space you open as well. So I make this relationship between geographical space and mental space, if you know what I mean. And yeah, and so a lot of what I wrote in the 40 days, I mean, half the book is about walking anyway, came from those walks. And the fact that it's written in hendecasyllables, which has a flexible rhythm, and it allows a lot of binary play and so on, that also comes from the regular but flexible rhythm of walking.
And
of course, yes. And so how did I actually sit down and write them? Well, even though it's 41 days, because it begins with night zero. But it didn't take me 41 days and nights to write it. It took a lot longer, right? They're symbolic. So for the first 8 months, I was walking and writing compulsively almost every day. Yeah, I would make a lot of drafts, and I revised a lot more than I wrote. A lot of what I wrote also I discarded. But then the last 6 poems in the book took me over 2 years to write, because I was walking towards what I hoped would be a form of understanding and forgiveness and compassion related to the domestic violence that we heard before. But I needed more time to reach that understanding. And to find, I wrote 3 endings and scrapped them. And then the final ending is, I managed to find a way, a metaphorical way, of forgiving without forgiving, if you know what I mean. And translation, well, so when this book was shortlisted for the European Poet of Freedom Prize in Poland, they asked me if any of it had been translated into Polish. And I said, no, I have a Polish friend who has done The Passport. We can speak to her. Right? But I had to do a bridge translation first, from Maltese into English, for her to work on. Right? And initially, I thought it would be psychologically difficult to rewrite it in English. But the difficulty was mostly linguistic. It wasn't easy. I did have to go through certain emotions again. Some bits kind of not only rewriting, but filling the blanks in English, because I believe that translation continues to write the original. right? It's not just a rewriting. You have to adapt metaphors, and then the translation offers you new sound play that will shed a new light on what's in the original. So I was rewriting and continuing to write it at the same time. But I wouldn't be able to do that alone, even though English, you could say, English and Maltese are like they're both my first language, but they're both my second language, you know what I mean? So without the help of Albert Gudd, who's editing the English version, they wouldn't be publishable. He helped me to see certain vices that I have in English, like inventing phrasal verbs and so on. But most of all, it's the discussion on certain words. Albert has a very rich vocabulary, and I mean, we're friends, of course. We're very good friends, and I know how he thinks linguistically, and the English version, it won't only be mine, it will be both of us.
So has putting yourself in the shoes of, well, in that case it was yourself, but when you translate somebody else's work, you do actually have to put yourself in their shoes. Do you do that, or do you actually think this is something else? This is, you were saying this is, you know, a rewriting? You were
No, when I translate poetry, for example, I put myself more in the shoes of the imaginary reader, right? I'm thinking more of how the Maltese reader, if it's Maltese, will receive the poem. I'm thinking more about the language.
Kind of.
I mean, I try to be loyal to the author as well, but if the language offers me a fine-tuned metaphor, for example, that kind of continues to write the original, but without going too far away, and if the author agrees, right, then, yeah.
I think you could go on forever, so let's move on to the next object.
Right, what's this?
This is... Wait a minute, this goes with these, and now you have to decipher a bit here.
Okay, so here we have coins. This is from the UAE. This is a euro, and this is a shoe or a flip-flop.
Yeah, well, that's something you would buy when you go on a holiday, right?
Yeah, it's a souvenir, Malta and Goza. It's the tira, the tadoeira.
So there's coins from different parts of the world. There's something you would buy, so traveling. There's a sense of pilgrimage, right? You've already touched upon it in 40 days. Obviously, it's not a traditional sense. It's you facing your doubts and struggles, and you retell moments of your childhood, and at some point, you function. The poem functions on a metaphorical plane.
Yeah.
Would you consider utilizing walking as a mode of transport for writing,
I'm glad you
or
asked
was it something that was related to that in particular? And I wanted also to refer briefly also to your earlier work, the mosaic poems and the multilingual usage. So the traveling and the use of different languages and the cosmopolitan you.
So I'm going to tie in the sense of pilgrimage with language, okay? For me, this book, it was a pilgrimage towards understanding, towards the possibility of compassion, okay? But also, I had to make peace with the Maltese language in a way, because I mean, you know, when I speak Maltese, I have a certain accent, right? And that's because until the age of 8, I lived in London with my parents, who are both Maltese. But our mother spoke to us in English, not because she's from Sliema, but because she wanted to, for her own reasons, she wanted to cut off with Malta almost completely, and also because it was more practical to speak to us in English. The Maltese language, we would mostly hear at night time, whenever my father would come, because he didn't come every night. For me and for my younger brothers, until I was 8, Maltese was the language of violence. It was the language of being ordered around, from the most banal thing like bashilu, iftahlu, whatever, to ala halig and even worse, right? But I associated Maltese with my father beating my mother at night time. And it wasn't until I came to live with my grandparents in Rendi, on my father's side, that I began to see Maltese in a completely different way and start to use it. But after around 4 years, my brothers and I went back to England to a boarding school, and we lost contact with Maltese. So it wasn't until I was 26 that I made the conscious decision to come here and spend 2 years with my grandparents to relearn Maltese. And now I work in Maltese as a translator. But even though it's of the languages I speak, Maltese is the one that speaks to me the deepest. It's the one I love the most, by far. Until I was approaching the age of 40, there was still that little fear of Maltese and of certain expressions. But also, I noticed that the older I get, the more I physically and acoustically resemble my father, my childhood enemy. I don't want to demonize my father more than necessary because he did the good things too, which I'll come to now actually, because you asked about travel, yeah? So, I thought maybe there would be a map in here. But no, is there a map there?
No, because you have one already.
Okay, we will see a map. All right. So, my relationship with maps is very complicated. So how we came to Malta when I was 8? We didn't come by plane. The worst, maybe, and the best thing my father ever did was this. So after a Christmas of where the violence reached its peak, there's a poem in this book where I'm hiding behind a Christmas tree and I witness with my own eyes what I had heard for so many nights, right? Basically, my father beating my mother into the carpet. Yeah, my mother came to pick us up from school, and she said, boys, we're not going home, we're going to live with some friends. And so we went to some Maltese friends of my mother on the other side of London. 1 month later, my father appeared, and they made a deal that my father would visit us every Sunday. So he came the first time, took us out for a meal, and took us back. And we thought the following Sunday he would do the same, we go for a meal and we come back. But so the second time, it happened to be the day after Valentine's Day. So he came with a big bouquet of flowers. And I thought, yeah, okay, maybe they get back together. Maybe Pa will change. Huh? And we thought we were going for a burger. And then when we're in the car, my father says, yeah, we're going to Malta by car. So, yeah, we went home. I had to grab clothes as quickly as possible. I had to get my little brother's clothes and so on. And I was crying for the first 2 or 3 days because I missed my mother, and I knew that she didn't know where we were. The police were after us, but what my father did was he took us across to France, Belgium, and then we were already in Germany by the end of the night, right? So, and we eventually ended up spending a whole month zigzagging around Central Europe, Western and Central Europe. And of course, after 3 or 4 days, for me, it became an adventure. And we had a huge road atlas of Europe. And as I'm the oldest of the 3 boys, I was sitting in front, and I was the navigator. And this way, my father, he kind of empowered me, right? And because the police were after us, and my father didn't want to arrive in Malta too quickly, he didn't really have any itinerary. So he would say, okay, where are we going? And I would look on this map, and I would say, Mönchengladbach, let's go there, according to the music of the name or whatever. No? And that trip, it opened my mind. It opened my mind to the possibility of travel, to geography. I became a total map freak, and yeah.
And nowadays you still do travel a lot.
Yes, yeah, I still
By
travel
car?
a lot. Yeah, so yeah, last month I drove all the way here. That's right. Because I'm based in Luxembourg, I came from Bratislava to here by car because now I want to write about that road trip. Partly to, but it's only one small reason, right? But it's an important reason because I haven't told the full truth about my father here. Of course, he's been idealized, conceptualized as a beast, but he's not only that, right? So I want to do justice to him in that way. But also, I want to kind of recover some of those memories. And whilst I was driving, certain moments would come up that I had completely forgotten them. Just, for example, the image of my father driving, but barefoot. Not only barefoot, but with only his big toe on the on the gas. You know, it's like just these images, and yeah.
Next.
Yeah, we need to speed up, I guess, because we're supposed to only take 20 minutes. What's this? What is this? It's
Something that is supposed to bring you good luck.
Okay, it's
lucky
like a
charm?
trinket. Yeah. La carota or something like that. No, it's an Italian custom.
Well, yeah, Naples or such.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, something you're supposed to get. Now, this was inspired by a lot I've been reading. This is about passport now. A lot I've been reading about. So one of the arguments about open borders is a moral one. So when someone is born entirely as a matter of chance, is entirely where is born is a matter of chance, then there is a moral justification for compelling people to stay in a poor country. By the same token, those lucky enough to have been born in rich countries have no rights to exclude others from their good fortune. So there's always a recurring word, luck. When you read about migrants, you know, you read their stories, those who are able to tell their stories, and they say, we were lucky enough to be able to tell our story. So if I die, that's the migrant dilemma. If I die, it's bad luck. So every year, migrants die trying. Some almost die trying, and they return home. Others, but that has never stopped them from trying their luck. Now, this is just for you to introduce why you wrote Passport and what is your story there.
Yeah, it's quite a long story. I'm going to keep it as short as I can. So the Passport, it's a very personal poem, but I guess it's also collective. So I was traveling in South America with the backpack in 2009, and on the border between Peru and Bolivia, I was traveling with my Maltese passport, the real one, and I went through this kind of micro-humiliation. So there was a soldier with a rifle hanging from his neck, and when I gave him the Maltese passport, he became a cartoon character. The pantomime began, and Malta? And then he started looking around at his soldier colleagues. Malta? 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 And there was another soldier sitting by a desk, and he got really excited all of a sudden. He banged his hand on the table and he said, Malta! And the reason why he was so excited was because he had a list of countries sellotaped to the desk, and he had next to each country the price. And so 2 weeks before I had begun traveling, I had saw on the internet, the website of the ministry, that it was free for Maltese citizens to enter Bolivia, but I didn't know that in the meantime, the bilateral disagreement between the two countries had changed. And suddenly, I did have to pay. But when he asked me for money, usted tiene que pagar 498 bolivianos. So this was a number with all these syllables, and it sounded like a lot of money. And most of all, I thought that he was bribing me. And I couldn't, I had no idea. But because there were rifles hanging from their necks, I couldn't really argue. Anyway, eventually I got the change that I needed to get it, and I realized later on that he hadn't bribed me at all, and so I felt ashamed for having judged these soldiers that were just doing their job and whatever. And so to overcome that kind of shame, but also my anger for having been put on the spotlight in front of all these tourists and being judged for coming from an imaginary island that they hadn't heard of. Whilst I was walking in, again, walking led to the passport. Yeah, I didn't make that connection. While I was walking in Chilean Patagonia a couple of weeks later, I wrote the first stanza, and then I started to research. And the reason, the collective reason, of course, for writing that poem is because I don't believe that freedom or privilege of movement should be a matter of luck, of where you're born. I don't believe it should be a matter of how much money you have in your bank account, or the value of your currency and so on. I believe in freedom of movement, not privilege of movement. There's so much more to be said about passports and the sale of Maltese ones and so on, but there's no time now. I go for the next. So I already mentioned Dante. This is Il Paradiso, La Divina Commedia. What's your question? Because
this is the most unreadable book that I could find on my bookshelves. not because it's the Paradiso. It's not Dante's Paradiso, this one. Look at it better. It's somebody else's paraphrases of it.
Okay.
I think we were talking about it the other night. It's an indication of how we are supposed to read and give it meaning. So it's a summary of its contents, it's a summary, an exclamation of the metaphors and the figures of speech. So I struggled with it. I do struggle. I struggled just by opening it. So are there books that you struggle with? This is a question about you as a reader, not about Paradiso. What kind of reader are you? Is there a book that is not supposed to be opened for you? And what is the most inaccessible book that you have come across?
Off the top of my head, the Divina Commedia is not inaccessible, I think, but it takes time to get into the Inferno, of course, because it's 13th century, 14th century Italian, and Tuscan, sorry. So it takes a while to get, but like Petrarch, you need to get used to his language first. I like books where you have to kind of learn the language as you're reading. Andrea Camilleri, who writes rest in peace, Andrea Camilleri, who wrote the Montalbano series. He teaches you his particular mix of standard Italian and Sicilian. And from book to book, the language becomes more complex, right? So it's his way of inviting you into his world by teaching you the language. But the most inaccessible book I've ever read, there's some Maltese poetry I find very inaccessible, but I don't want to mention any names.
So let's move to the...
Yeah, let's move on.
Let's move on to the something related to this, but the multiple levels. In an interview, I think to Maria Gregganado, you were mentioning about how important it is that poetry has multiple levels, so that you have to go back to it. You don't have to just read it and say, okay, that's it, all right, that was nice. But you want to go back to it because it has to have multiple levels. Now, in your earlier poetry, for example, in the mosaic poems, for example, where you have different languages, you have meanings, that can be absorbed by reading them. How did that change in 40 days?
Okay. Well, when I wrote the Mosaici, it's nearly 15 years now. That was when I came to Malta at the age of 26 to relearn the Maltese language properly. And I didn't know what language to write in at the time. I felt if I wrote in a single language, I would be lying to myself because I had lived in France for a while, in Italy. I had spent 4 years in Madrid, so Spanish was pretty much on top. And of course, English was always present, right? I didn't know what language to write in, so I began to experiment with the 5. And after a while, it became a form of self-expression. But eventually, as the Maltese language had been knocking on the door, Maltese, it very quietly, softly slammed the door down, and I had to go into the monolingual. Speaking of the levels, like this was, I think, an interview with Marie Benoit in the Malta Independent that you're referring to. Yeah, as a reader, and also as a writer, I don't want the whole meaning to be there immediately on first reading. I like it when a poem pulls me in and then invites me to, okay, I'm going to read it again and connect one thing to another. Inter and intra-textuality make literature very rich. And the 40 days, yeah, I had to write it in Maltese because I had to overcome the fear of that voice in my head, which is mine, but which sounds like my father's, right?
Next.
Yeah. What's this? Film, cartridge. Photographs, image.
Yeah, we've had this conversation, I think, also last night, some couple of days ago. The idea of the Kodak film is a question about your book having photographic qualities, and if when reading it, you can just consider it as a picture of the past now, 40 days, or of a having been there, like Roland Barthes would say about photography. You know, when you press the shutter, that picture is no longer you, you know, that image in that picture is no longer you. That's something that belongs to the past. What do you think of Erbainu when you read it now? You still, you consider it as a cathartic, you know, having
yes.
been a
yeah, it was very cathartic. One of the poems, Night 32, I think it is a description of a photograph that I found a few years ago in my aunt's place, where you see my mother and myself and my three brothers. I was 3, and my brothers were 1, and the other one, he's like 4 or 5 days old. But my mother is in the middle, and there are scratches and bruises on her face. It's not a very brutal photo, because it's suggestive. And this poem describes the photograph, but also how I feel 30 years later looking at it. You know? But I don't want to give away much more about it. Can we go to the map?
Because let's do.
Here, so don't worry about these because of the time, right? So we were speaking about maps already, and maps, they feature a little bit in these poems, but for the Polish version that will come out in the autumn, we were going to include endnotes that describe, that explain some of the landmarks around Urendi. So this map by Stephen Shikluna will be used instead of the endnotes, right? There will be a legend below it. This is the area from Widi Zorri all the way to Hajar Im Naidra. Filfla is also there. And it was important to include this in the Polish book. And if there's ever a second edition of the Maltese one, I would include it as well. Because Day 29 is a walk in that area, right? And I would like to finish with what I call the prayer to Filfla, which comes at the end of this walk. Allimni, gżejra żiża, nagħmel bħalik. Allimni ma ntertirx fil-għodwa riesħa. Allimni ma niġrix wara x-xemx nieżla. Allimni nibqa' sod. Allimni niflaħ ir-riħ bla nitniffes. Allimni nilqa' il-mewġ bla nintrifes. Allimni niġma' id-dawl bla nittanta naħfnu f'dirajja. Allimni nħobb mill-bod bla ma nixtieq. Għallimni ma naqfilx li ruq ma xfiq. Għallimni inkun rifugju għal kull tajra. Għallimni nrodd il-wens lil kull min jimxi ma xifer l-irdum. Għallimni inkun ankra għal għajnejn li jintilfu f'qies il-baħar u bil-kappelli għandi insellem lura. Għallimni ma nibżax minn kull ħajbura. Għallimni nkun immaġni ta' sħuħija għal kull min ħas f'sidru il-kisra taċ-ċaħda. Intant sa jroxx il-lejl, nibqgħu bil-qiegħda, nissemma u nodi l-ħalel waħda waħda.
Thank you.
We have a mirror, a candle.